Welcome everybody to this evening's talks, which are in our series, The Kentoneers, which is a lovely name, and we know we're in for some really good stories of our members. It's a really lovely series. I'd like to welcome people who have come to join us from around the world. We have Henry's sister in America and brother-in-law, welcome. And we may have his son, Daniel, in Hong Kong, but he's probably fast asleep, so we don't know. And I'd like to welcome from Israel, the Hatmans, who are here at the moment, who come onto our Zoom again, which is really nice, and everyone else who has come. So tonight's talk, on the poster, they were in alphabetical order, so we're going to keep to that order. You'll find that our guests will speak for about 15 minutes, and I think we'll have questions at the end of all the talks. So save your questions, and I'm going to ask Pricilla to speak first. Sorry?
Just before Pricilla speaks, I'm going to mute everyone, so Irene and Pricilla, if you can unmute yourself there. Okay? Please unmute yourself, Irene.
Okay, you muted me. Okay, I'm going to introduce Pricilla without stealing her thunder from things that she's going to say. Pricilla, as you all know, is very involved with Schul Affairs, and she is co-chair of the Ladies Guild at the moment, but she has been heavily involved with board management for many, many years and lots of other activities. Pricilla grew up in Stamford Hill, and she and Mike have two sons who we know very well, Alex and Benji, and they have 4 grandchildren. I better not say any more because it might take off what Priscilla's going to say. So welcome, Pricilla, over to you. There's some noise. Can everybody mute? Okay, Pricilla, would you like to unmute?
Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see you all. My early days were on the Woodbury Down estate, which is between Manor House and Stamford Hill, as Irene has said. And this area has, over the past few years, had a major makeover and become a highly desirable residential area. The block of flats I was brought up in was only demolished quite recently, and there are a few others remaining. I have renewed my relationship with the area as I have been delivering for US Hesed to nearby Finsbury Park Shul, where my brother had his bar mitzvah. And it has been a very nostalgic and poignant reminder of how the area has changed in so many ways, but not in others. The 50s and 60s were a time of change, and the Woodbury Down estate was a very large council estate with its own dedicated health centre, doctor, primary school, and ultimately comprehensive school, which was the first of its kind. My brother was a pupil during the first year, and I can remember the school being opened by Mrs. Pandit, the sister of Mr. Nehru, the Indian Prime Minister. My parents actually sold their house in nearby Bethune Road in Stamford Hill, as they thought the council would look after them and the family, and that this was a better economic bet, less than 10 years after the war. I went to local Woodbury Down Primary School with my brother, who is 2.5 years younger than me. I loved my teacher, Miss MacDonald. Amazing how I remember her name. However, I was not popular when during the school holiday in Seaford, Sussex, I woke her up to tell her I couldn't sleep. I later fell asleep, but she didn't. Mummy had other ideas. I never ever found out her motive for trying to enlist my brother and myself in the Davida Goldsmith Jewish primary school, especially when she decided I had to leave Hayder when I started my secondary school. Pricilla had other ideas. I got to Dr. Schonfield's desk for enrolment, turned tail and ran, with my brother after me, my mother, and then Dr. Schonfield. Mummy didn't attempt to enrol me again. I succeeded in my 11 plus and went to Skinner's Company School for Girls in Stamford Hill, which was even then the home of an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. I saw strimals, capotas and white stockings long before they reached Golders Green. I can remember how there was a degree of resentment amongst my primary school friends that I was going to grammar school. I got my O levels, but didn't proceed to A levels, much to the chagrin of my headmistress, who did her best to persuade those who were not going into the sixth form to change their minds. She wasn't successful. It was mostly the Jewish girls who didn't stay on. I went on to Tottenham Technical College for a secretarial course together with business, French and German. My parents at this stage had a tobacco and confectionery shop in Westbourne Park, where I often went to help after school. The shop was compulsorily purchased in order to build Westway. My parents worked 6.5 days a week, and Sunday afternoon was a treat. We went to Lyons Corner House for tea. After the shop had closed, Daddy became a local manager for Bewley's Tobacconists. And who was his area manager? Our very own Roy Block. Daddy managed the shop near Claridge's and took great delight in telling us all about the chauffeurs and personalities who came into his shop, which was opposite the hotel. We have all been made aware of Ridley Road due to the Select television series. I was actually at that 1962 demonstration when Oswald Mosley tried to speak. I was with my father, brother and cousin, and my brother still relates how violent it was. My cousin was injured by a police horse during the violence. My father, who'd been at the Battle of Cable Street, never ever expected to see fascists marching through London again. It was during my year at college that I started to attend the youth club attached to Ayliffe Gardens in Temple Fortune. I travelled 3 times a week on the 210 bus from Finsbury Park to Golders Green, and sometimes on my walk home from the bus stop, I was accompanied by a curb crawler, once even a Rolls Royce. In those days, they didn't get out of the car or try to persuade you to join them, just looked and wound down the window. It didn't deter me, I just carried on walking. I had the opportunity to take articles to train as a lawyer, but decided against that career course and have always regretted it. I also had the opportunity to work in Lucerne and Rouen, but could never summon the courage to actually take up the positions offered. The youth group at Ayliffe Gardens, together with that of Hendon Reform and West London Synagogue, had a deep impact on me. Hitherto, I had been going to the youth clubs at Victoria Club in Stamford Hill and Oxford and St George's, where all you did was play table tennis and chat. Reform youth clubs at that time were way ahead of the US in their attitude to youth work. We ran our own clubs with our own chairmen and committees, organised our own programmes and activities, and once a year participated in a summer school, many of which were held in Tyringham near Newport Pagnell. It was at one of these summer schools that I learned at first hand about the Holocaust. My parents had not spoken to us about it, but I knew they had lost many relatives in Russia. My parents were both born here, but not my grandparents. I am obviously, therefore, second generation. I made a vow, which I have kept, to make sure my children were well aware of all that had happened during the Holocaust, and Benjamin, our son, has continued this. I listened to Rabbi Abraham Stutendorp, who was then a rabbinical student at the Leerbeck College and is still a close friend, together with his wife, Sarah. He and his wife were hidden children during the war. Their parents had to go from farm to farm looking for them after liberation. Some of you may remember them singing at Benji's Bar Mitzvah, and I have spoken about Sarah's family's experiences at one of our Holocaust memorial events. I also met the late Rabbi Hugo Grin. He was a friend of Mike's parents. I'm sure many of you will remember him from the Moral Maze on Radio 4. These rabbinic personalities were powerful influences. I'd never really got to know any Rabbonim or even had the opportunity to do so. My parents were 3 times a year United Synagogue Jews. My father had faith and was a fluent Hebrew reader up until the time he passed away at the age of nearly 96. Mummy was more skeptical, but never stood in my way as I became more and more inquisitive about Judaism and started to attend discussion groups and evening classes. After my secretarial course, I went on to work for lawyers, the Optician magazine, Queen's Counsel and surveyors. Being secretary to Queen's Counsel was entry into another world of barristers' chambers, clerks, wigs and gowns, a Victorian world which has survived into the 21st century. One member of the chambers was a member of the of Common Council, which runs the City of London. In 1966, I participated in the first Jewish Youth Conference to be held in Berlin since the war. The group was shown the sights, including the Brandenburg Gate and Checkpoint Charlie, looking into a grim, drab East Berlin from a surprisingly buzzing West Berlin. Yes, the description by John le Carré in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold is wholly accurate. I remember sitting with Sarah, Abraham's wife, as she sobbed, to be in Germany just over 20 years after the war, to have survived, and at the loss of so many of her family. This was a deep and very sobering encounter for me. Here I was experiencing at first hand the trauma of a survivor. In 1968, I started going out with Michael. We were married and moved to Wembley. Mike and I were married in September 69 and honeymooned in Yugoslavia, where Michael's company had strong business connections, which enabled us to take more than £50 spending money as I acted as German interpreter at the Zagreb Fair, where their suppliers were exhibiting. Our first holiday was in 1970 to Israel. This was my first time, but Michael had been going since 1963 and was a volunteer in 1967. Part of our trip was spent at the kibbutz where he had been living during that time. We have since made many, many trips to Israel and have maintained many strong friendships. We have a niece living in Israel, and my brother made Aliyah 3 years ago. Even though Michael and I had met through Reform youth groups, Michael had attained his orthodoxy with a strong foundation that an education at Carmel College had given him. I began to find Reform Judaism less satisfying and was happy to join Kenton and start to participate. Benji was born in 1972 and Alex in 1977. They joined the toddlers group, which I helped run, and then with Irene ran the library for the weekday Heda. When Benji started school, I returned to work. John le Carré crossed my path again. A friend of mine was working for a literary agent and asked me to join as a secretary. Her boss was a wartime friend to John le Carré and was his literary agent, but I never ever met him. I became pregnant with Alex, and so I didn't stay in this job for very long. I returned to part-time secretarial temp work when both boys were at school, which led me to Lee Barron Property Managers in Golders Green. This company was the brainchild of one Leo Noe, who now supports the Jewish News. I stayed with the company until January of this year, through at a number of locations, and finally in the heart of London in Regent Street. Whilst the children were at school, I was given 6 weeks holiday leave in the summer, 3 weeks at Pesach and Christmas time. There was always a job to go back to. I was extremely lucky to have such understanding employers. They were also Orthodox Jews. Here again, I feel I was so fortunate. I saw how it could be, how it should be, caring, understanding, and flexible in your employee and employer relationship with and for all. One of the directors was in fact a Hatzalah organizer. I'd never heard of this organization. I'm very pleased that the Hampmans are with us because I want to talk about how Mike and I became involved with BFIWD, hosting disabled Israeli soldiers when they came to London for a 2-week holiday. I thought this was a good idea to ensure that the children had a positive attitude to those less able than themselves. I remember being vetted by Rita Levy as to the suitability of our house, the stairs, etc., etc. It was heartrending to see a tall, handsome soldier sitting in his wheelchair and watching so longingly as our children played football in the garden, but heartwarming to experience the friendships that were created and maintained, and to watch their smiling faces as they danced in their wheelchairs at the last night's party, held on so many occasions at the Majestic in Willesden by kind permission of Mrs. Boyd, and lastly in the youth club across the road from the Shawl. Some years later, I went with Rita to Stoke Mandeville Hospital to watch as our first soldier was fitted with a body corset, which unfortunately was only successful for a very short time, but I saw how tall he was when he stood up. He was 6'4". During the 80s, I was involved with a Radwitzo, and in 1984 jointly led a group of 40 women to Israel. As a leader, I participated in a commemoration ceremony at Yad Vashem and was interviewed for Haaretz newspaper. In the late 90s, I joined the Israeli army for a week, together with other Kenton members, via thell, when we sorted gas masks and batteries, so relieving the army of these mundane tasks. I received an honourable discharge. I was asked to sit on the board at Kenton as one of the first US communities to have women on the board, or council as it now is. And I was privileged to be one of the first female executive officers. It was not an easy position to have. We didn't have a brief. We sat at meetings and gave our opinions, but we were the trailblazers for all the women who later took on executive roles, including our dear Irene, within the Kenton community and the US at large. But as you all know, walking is my favourite pastime. I participated in the JNF Walk for Water in '97 at raising £3,500. We then joined Cream Tea Walks, a long afternoon walk ending with a cream tea, which was always waiting for us wherever we finished. The organiser's husband must have been a saint with a Volvo estate. I also joined Northwest Group of the Rambling Association, which meant a 12-mile walk every Sunday. This was very good training for all the walking that followed. It was not long afterwards that my friend Eric from my Ailith Gardens Youth Group days got the walking bug and started his own group, the North London Trekkies. There was a walk every Sunday, as well as weekends away in the countryside. Eric broadened his horizons, and international walking was on the agenda. I have been lucky to have 3 wonderful walking trips to Israel, to the Negev, Mitzpe Ramon, and the Galil, as well as the Peloponnese in Greece, Andorra, where I bought tax-free jewellery and 18-year-old Glenlivet for Michael, Sicily, where I cuddled trees, met American veterans of the Palermo landings, and climbed the recently erupted lava-burnt slopes of Mount Etna, Slovenia, where I was able to explore the beautiful town of Ljubljana, Montenegro, where the shops in the countryside are still mainly shacks, Mallorca, where we collected wild mushrooms, Lake Como and the World Heritage Site near Lake Orta, Calabria in southern Italy, where the mafia have siphoned off so much government money and where the difference between the affluent north and the much poorer south is so evident. Bulgaria, where I narrowly missed seeing the inside of the largest shul in Europe in Sofia. It was a national holiday, and so it was closed. Albania, twice, where our luggage was transported on donkeys, and where in the modern area of Tirana, I was reminded of Tel Aviv, but a museum of secret learning devices didn't go down too well. And unfortunately, where the guide's wife, who was a qualified doctor, couldn't practice because they could not raise the €3,000 needed for her practicing certificate. We were due to go to Romania last year, but that was thwarted by COVID. These walks enabled me to see and experience many cultures and many sites that I would not have seen as a tourist. And I am indebted to my dear friend Eric for all these marvellous and exciting experiences, which hopefully will continue for a long time to come. In 2010, I walked 15 miles between Rotterdam and the Hook of Holland in the most dreadful storm along the canal, which, if the wind had been blowing the other way, I would not have been speaking to you. This was the last stretch of Rabbi Wittenberg's walk from Germany, across Germany, from his grandfather's shul in Frankfurt, which was destroyed during Kristallnacht, to the Hook of Holland, where his family embarked to freedom. Some of you may not be aware of how the Ramblers Association started. Kinderscout is the highest part of the Peak District, and in the early 20th century was close to many industrial areas. At the weekend, many people living in these areas wanted to go for a walk in the nearby countryside, but they were prevented by owners and gamekeepers. On Sunday, 24th April 1932, 400 walkers trespassed up Kinderscout, undaunted by the gamekeepers. There were 4 and 5 arrests, but this mass trespass was the forerunner of the right to roam and the free access to the countryside, which we take for granted today. The song that we're going to play, just about to play, describes the events of that mass trespass. I don't fulfill the criteria, but you will get the gist of what happened. Okay. Listen carefully.
slept up on Croton, I've camped by the Wainstones as well. I've Sunday done kinder, been burned to a cinder, and many more things I can tell. My rucksack is up in it below, the heather has up in my bed, and sooner than part from the mountains, I think I would rather be dead. I'm a rambler from Manchester way. I get all the pleasure, the heart on the play. I may be away straight on Monday, but I am a free man on Sunday. The day was just ending and I was descending down Brian's Brook just by upper toe, when a voice cried, "Hey you!" in the way keepers do. He's the worst face that ever I saw. The things that he said were unpleasant. In the teeth of his fury I said, sooner than far from the mountains, I think I would rather be dead. I'm a rambler from Manchester way. I get all the pleasure, the heart all the way. I may be away straight on Monday, but I am a free man on Sunday. He called me a louse and said, think of the grass. Well, I thought, but I still couldn't see. My old kinder scout and the laws round about couldn't take both the poor grouse and me. He said, all this land is my master's, and that I stood shaking my head. No man has the right to own mountains any more than the deep ocean bed. I'm a rambler from Manchester way. I get all my pleasure, the heart on the way. I may be away slave on Monday, but I am a free man on Sunday. I once loved a maid, a spot welder by trade. She was fair as the rowan in bloom, and the blue of her eye matched the June morning sky, and I would have from April till June. On the day that we should have been married, I went for a ramble instead. For sooner than far from the mountains, I think I would rather be dead. I'm a rambler from Manchester way. I get all the pleasure, the heart all the way. I may be a wage slave on Monday, but I am a free man on Sunday. So I'll walk where I will, over mountain and hill, and I'll lie where the packer is he. I belong to the mountains, the clear running fountains, where the grey rocks rise rugged and steep. I've seen the white hair in the gullies, and the curlew fly high overhead. And sooner than far from the mountains, I think I would rather be dead. I'm a rambler from Manchester way. I get all the pleasure, the heart all the way. I may be a wage slave on Monday, but I am a free man on Sunday.
Well, I hope you were able to discern some words from that. I'll continue the story. Rabbi Znaimer married our son Benjamin to Yasmin in November 2005. Football having cemented a bond between Rabbi Znaimer and Benjamin during the shul trip to Poland in May 1999, one of the events to mark the community's 60th anniversary. On the last night of the trip, Rabbi Znaimer arranged for the match between Manchester United and Bayern Munich to be recorded in our Warsaw hotel, to avert a walkout of all the football fanatics, my son being an avid Manchester United supporter. In October 2008, Benji and Yaz presented us with our first grandchild, Jamie, followed in April 2011 by Ruby. Alex and Joe presented us with Charlie in February 2015 and Luca in December 2016. In March 2014, as I'm sure you all know, I fell out the loft and broke my left leg. I will never forget the way the community responded, nor of course the incident itself, with Michael asking the paramedics to mind the wallpaper as they lifted the stretcher with me on it over the banisters. It was 2 weeks before Pesach. There was a continuous supply of food, visitors and help, 4 lots of flavour and homemade biscuits. I was able to resume walking in following December and thankfully have not suffered any after effects. I finally retired in January of this year and have made the transition from a part-time worker to nil and pleasing myself. The local U3A has given me an added dimension, as well as utilising whatever brain cells may remain, resuming French and enjoying English literature with our own David Harris, as well as a monthly Scrabble session. Obviously, working for the same company for over 30 years, living in the same house, and having the same husband for over 50 years, and being part of the Kenton community since 1970 has worked its own magic. The friendships, the celebrations, the mutual experiences, the good times and the not so good times. Yes, the area has changed. The shul has changed, but one thing has not. The dynamism and dedication of this community, which has been so apparent during the past 18 months. May we all go from strength to strength and have a healthy and satisfying year ahead. Thank you for listening.
Shakaya.
Wonderful, Priscilla. That was so interesting. It's amazing you can be friends with someone for such a long time and still learn things about them that you didn't know. It was wonderful. And it's also lovely that throughout your lives, your Judaism has remained central and it stayed with everything that you do. Wonderful. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for listening.
Okay, well, as I said before, I think we'll proceed on, so don't go away. Questions at the end. Okay, so now our next Kentoneer is Judie Finesilver. Again, I'll tell you a little bit about her, but she will tell the rest. Judie came from Manchester, where she was born and brought up, and she came to London in 1982. She's been married for Morris for 36 years, and they have 4 children and a pussycat. She has been a hospital pharmacist working within the patient safety area to improve the outcomes for medication administration. She's a very artistic and friendly lady. Judie, over to you.
Thank you. So let me start. I've got some slides that I want to share with you. So let me share my screen. See if that works. Share screen. Okay, and that's working. Hope that's working. Yes, good. Thank you. Okay, so as Irene said, I was born in South Manchester in a Sale, and I was privileged enough to know all of my 4 grandparents. They were all born in England, and some of their parents were also born here. But I have a number of family links to the Kenton community. This picture here shows the Shires family, my father's family, and on the right, the Berries, which is my grandmother's, my maternal grandmother's family. And the lady who is picked out at the bottom in the dock is a lady called Eta Simons, who some of you may have remembered. To her left is my grandma Sheila. But the Berries lived in Llandudno, and there were 5 siblings. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the Berries. So Eric and Eta Simons were some of the founding members of Kenton Shul, and their eldest son, Victor, celebrated his bar mitzvah as the 2nd bar mitzvah in this shul. Eta Simons, who you can see here, links to Kenton, was that she was one of the chairs of the Ladies' Guild at the beginning of Kenton Shore, but also she was a teacher at the Solomon Wolfson Junior School for over 20 years, becoming deputy head under David Band. And I think if the children had known that she was called Eta Berry, they would have given her a hard time. Eric, her husband, was the scoutmaster of the 11th Kenton Scouts based at Kenton Shore from the early 1960s for 10 years, until he was asked to be the Assistant District Commissioner for the whole of Kenton and Kingsbury area, and continued in that post until 1973. When he started as Group Scoutmaster for the 11th Kenton, it was a small and insignificant Jewish group in the district, but by the end of the decade it was the biggest and most influential group in the district. There are two examples of this. Firstly, they had an annual District Scout swimming gala at Kingsbury Pool. 11th Kenton always entered a team and were delighted if they actually scored a few points. They always finished last. But in 1963, Eric discovered that was a parent of one of the cubs who was a swimming coach, and he arranged for the team to be coached. In 63, instead of occupying the last position, they actually came first. And for the next few years, winning was the thing. A second example relates to the annual St. George's Day service and parade. Every year on the Sunday nearest the 23rd of April, all the Cubs and Scouts in the district attended a church service, which was followed by a parade through the streets. 11th Kenton always attended the parade, but of course did not attend the church service. Eric decided that this wasn't good enough. So around 1965, he decided that instead of a church service, the parade should be preceded by an interdenominational service in Kenton Shore. The other groups in the district agreed to this, although the Catholic group had to obtain special dispensation from the Vatican. So the service took place in Kenton Shore. The service was conducted by Rabbi Cyril Harris, resplendent in full Scout uniform, including shorts. And my cousin has an abiding memory of a rendition of "The Lord is my Shepherd" being sung by a full shul of Scouts and Cubs. I talked about the berries coming from Llandudno. So this is the Chabad house now in Llandudno, which was the shul in Llandudno, and my great-grandfather, Reverend Emmanuel Berry, was the Shomer and the Reverend at that shul. They also ran what was a guest house on the promenade called the Laurels, which was Berry's, and they had links to the Wartsky family, which is on the next slide. But it's interesting, I talked earlier about David Berry, possibly he was the youngest of the Berrys. And if you look in this slide here, there are two bits of extracts that I've taken from the Jewish Chronicle, from their archives. I'm lucky enough to be a member of something called My Heritage, and there's access to the Jewish Chronicle archive there, and it's been a fascinating journey for me. This says that in Llandudno, a special gathering of the Llandudno and Bangor Hebrew congregation held last week, a silver Kiddush cup was presented by Mr. M. Wartsky to the Reverend and Mrs. Berry in celebration of their silver wedding, and to mark the completion by Mr. Berry of 21 years ministry to the congregation. Below that is an extract about David Berry, aged 16, son of Reverend and Mrs. Berry of Llandudno. On passing the higher school certificate examination, has been awarded the Richard Owen Scholarship to the value of £40 a year for 3 years. The school that he attended was so delighted with this that they gave everybody half a day leave, and everybody went off. This school, as you know, is still in Llandudno, and it's under the auspices of Chabad now. As I said earlier, all my grandparents were born in England, and some of their parents were also born here. Of my grandparents, all were firstborn in their respective families, so the generations are quite clear-cut in my family tree. On the right at the back is my grandfather, Ellis Silverman, and in front is Abe Shires. I'm just going to talk about Ellis Silverman for a moment. He was a tailor and outfitter. And I can trace family members back a long way in his line. So there's me at the bottom, and I can trace Ellis Silverman back 9 generations, through my mother, through Ellis Silverman, through Maya Silverman, who was married to Pauline Wiseguard. And Pauline Wiseguard's ancestors go all the way back to Marcus Wiskurtzer. What's also interesting, I think, about this slide is that my great-grandfather, Mark Shires, formerly Sherlag, changed his name to Shires. But on the right-hand side, in my maternal line, is a lady called Matilda Shires, who married a gentleman called Wiseguard. And although my grandfather, or my great-grandfather, Mark Shires, made up the name, it was very coincidental that there was a Shires already in my family. So as well as Rabbi Emmanuel Berry in my family history, there's also a Rabbi Tobias Kletz, and also I have cousins, currently Rabbi Emmanuel Levy in Palmer's Green. So there's a number of Rabbonim there. Just to look at this information, Samuel Wiskurtzer became Wiseguard over the generations. This is just a snapshot from my heritage where you can trace people back, and it's just amazing. So Samuel was my 8th generation, and his father and mother, Marcus and Devora, were listed 9th generation from Poland. It's amazing what you can find out. This is a picture of 4 generations of my father's family. That's my father as a baby, with his mother, her father, and his mother. And my father always called his great-grandmother Bobby, which of course it was actually Bubba. But it's interesting that I don't think he ever realised that it was Bubba, because he always knew her as Bobby. My father's family, his grandparents owned a ladies' coat factory. Also in my father's family is Sharon Carr's mother. Sharon Carr's an old member of the Kenton community, and her mum Zena is my dad's first cousin. My dad was a pharmacist like me, so we have a link there, but he was also a keen photographer, and I'm lucky enough to hold his photo archive of still photos and cine film, now digital. I'd just like to share with you some photos of the family, which I hope will go if the PowerPoint works. So this is Bobby, or Bubba, and these are all my great-great-grandparents. And then this picture is of my great-grandfather and his friends enjoying a laugh, and I don't know what the occasion was, but they all seem to be having a really good time. So here's Sharon Carr that I was mentioned earlier. And other links to Kenton are through a summer school. I was a supervisor the year that Ben Cronin lost Ruth. I think that was 76. So I didn't get to meet her. But the Papier twins were there that year, as were Jeff and Georgie Leveson, Darren and Craig. And so it was very nice when I came to Kenton to bump into old friends. Here's me as a supervisor in that year. Oh, it was 76. So moving on, my career started as a hospital pharmacist, inspired by my dad and Sharon Carr, who I went to visit when she was a pre-registration pharmacist at Altrincham Hospital, although she can't recall the introduction. When I qualified as a pharmacist from Liverpool John Moores University, I came to London looking for my Prince Charming, or was it the Dick Whittington story? Well, I found him, Morris, and we have 4 lovely children, Leanne, Samuel, Rachel and Esther, plus a pussycat called Sooty. Leanne is married to Simon, and they will have been married 13 years in a couple of weeks' time. They have 2 lovely children, Joshua and Amelie, and they're just gorgeous. Sam and Emma are expecting their first baby in a couple of weeks, so that's very exciting. Rachel works for Lloyd's Bank, saving the planet, working on sustainability. And Esther is currently in New Zealand, experiencing life as a doctor, much more in a much more relaxed environment than here in the UK, and she's really enjoying it. I've got a page missing. There's a page. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry. Here we go. I worked all through my married life and moved hospitals. At one stage, I managed the pharmacy computer labelling and ordering systems for 8 different local hospitals. Central Middlesex, Wembley Hospital, Willesden Chest Hospital, Shenley Hospital, St Charles Hospital, Edgware General, Barnet General and Finchley Memorial. Then in the year 2000, I moved to the Department of Health, where I specialised in trying to help hospital pharmacists perform their work more easily and accurately with the age of technology, and trying to move the pharmacy computer systems into the 20th century, which is quite ironic because we were actually moving into the 21st century. But I basically worked in patient safety, supporting the 5 rights. That makes sure that the right medicine got to the right patient and the right dose via the right route at the right time. And that's been quite a challenge. We did this by harnessing the power of barcodes, which were already on packs of most medicines as they were in the retail environment. I was unofficially known as the pharmacy barcode guru. I spoke at many conferences and even travelled to New Zealand to deliver this concept. And it's disappointing to me that even today there are too few hospitals which have integrated technology built into their processes for medicines administration. I still work with the Barcode Authority GS1 to push this agenda forward, which I hope will see fruition in my lifetime. Although I'm semi-retired, I'm proud to have raised nearly £500 last week for breast cancer awareness. You might have seen me on the Kabbalat Shabbat Zoom call with pink hair. So that's my story. Thanks to Johnny Simons for his help with some of the photos, etc. And thanks for giving me this opportunity. And thanks for listening. If you feel like donating, then there's references there. If we could build it up to 500 quid, that would be great, because at the moment we're at 450. Thank you very much.
Shakaya.
Thank you, Judy. That was so interesting. Can you leave that link there? It was wonderful to hear about your career, and we've heard snippets along the way as you've been advising us on the WhatsApp group and things like that along this past year. Very interesting. And I was particularly interested in your wonderful photographs of your great-great-grandparents, and it's wonderful that you managed to get all that information. Again, I'm sorry, can people hold their questions till after Henry's talk? Okay. Henry, are you there still? Henry Margulies doesn't need a lot of introduction to Kenton. He and his wife were one of the major caterers for many of our functions along the years. But I think tonight, probably Henry wants to talk about his family history, and he really called this talk From the Clutches of the Holocaust to Kenton. Henry was born just a few months after his parents were liberated by the Soviet armed forces, and they had lived in a sewer for 14 months. Some of us had heard some of this story before, and it's so spellbinding. They arrived in the UK in 1948, and they spent 2 years in Dublin, 2 years in Staines, 26 years in Stamford Hill, and moved to Kenton when he got married in November 1979, and he's been here ever since. So welcome, Henry, and over to you for your story. Unmute yourself, Henry.
Right, here we go. Thank you. From the clutches of the Holocaust to Kenton. Yes, my mother and father were both liberated by the Soviet forces on the 25th of July, 1944, from the sewers of Lvov. from where they were hiding from the Germans and from the Ukrainian militia who were helping them. Unfortunately, my mother's sister and brother were both murdered in Belzec, 50 miles up the railway line from Lvov, where thousands of Jewish and other people were murdered by the Nazis. By my father's family, some of them were murdered also in Belzec as well, because that was the closest extermination point, and there was a railway from the Janowska ghetto concentration all the way to up to 55 miles up the railway line. After my parents were liberated, I was born on the end of October 1944 in Lvov. There was a Jewish hospital there called the Rappaport Hospital. It still exists with a Magen David. It was on the edge where there was a Jewish graveyard, a Jewish orphanage, which my father also attended. In the summer of 1945, after about 6 or 7 months, the Soviet authorities gave permission for Polish-speaking people to leave Lvov, which was a part of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, and then to leave and move over to Poland. My parents and all the other survivors who were with them in the sewer all left Lvov, and we went to live in Gliwice, which is a town not far from Krakow. We stayed there for about 1 year. Then my father saw was no good. Then we made our way through Czechoslovakia. Finally, we ended up in a DP camp in southern Germany near Passau. At that stage, my mother found that her uncle had survived the war and he was with the Polish army in the UK. My parents registered to go to the United States of America, but they had to wait for a quota and a visa. My mother's uncle said, come to London and wait in London for the visa and the documentation to arrive. So that's what we did. So we came to England. It was about February 1948. We went from the Hook of Holland by train right across Germany, and we went to Hook of Holland. We ended up in Harwich. Our first stop that my parents had, they had a job. They lived in Stoke Newington, St Kilda's Road, and then they had a job. Dr. Schonfeld gave them a job for 2 years, looking after refugee children in Ireland, in a castle, Cloney Castle, about 50 miles from Dublin, and later on in Dunleary. It was in Dunleary, it was in Ireland at the University Hospital that when my sister was born there as well. So she was born in Dublin. After 2 years, in 1950, my parents left Ireland and they came to England, and they lived in Egham near Staines. There was a yeshiva there, and they were looking after boys. And there was a boarding school in yeshiva by Rabbi Weingarten, and there they stayed for 2 years. And I still remember I attended my first school. I was about 5 then. I was attending my first school in a local school next to the Egham station. After 2 years, the yeshiva closed down. In 1952, we moved to Stoke Newington, to Heathland Road. My father got a job as a cook in the yeshiva, Mesivta College in Caysnorth Road. It was a Hasidic yeshiva, and he was looking after them. I started to go to school to the Avigdor, with the headmistress was Dr. Judie Schonfeld. But the people in yeshiva were not happy that I attended that school because it was a mixed school, boys and girls. So I had to go to a boys-only school, and I went to a more orthodox school, the Yesoda HaTorah school, which is in Amos Park in Stamford Hill. My parents continued to cook in the yeshiva, but what was happening? They weren't getting paid. There was no wages for them. So what do they start to do? A couple of years with a bit of restitution money, they started going to the catering. And that's how they started in about 1954, 1955, the start of the catering business. I stayed in school, in the Soda Tower School. I did my O-levels there till 1961. I spent 1 year, and I went to yeshiva. I went to spend a year in Gateshead Talmudical College after 1 year. Then I came back to London. Then I was do A-levels. Then I thought I'd do accountancy. I went to a firm called A.M. Clayman and Co. and I stayed there for 3 years. In 1967, in June, we had the 6-day war. So I decided to volunteer in Israel. So I went there for 1 year. I was helping in the army, take ammunition, and I worked on a kibbutz called Naan. We were making sprinklers there, water sprinklers and other items there. So I stayed in Israel for 1 year. It was a wonderful experience. After 1 year, I came back and I joined the family catering. In 1968, I joined the family catering business. In 1969, my sister got married to a lovely boy from Westcliff-on-Sea, Rabbi Simon, and they got 4 lovely children: Jonathan, Natasha, Tanya, and Anna Eliza, and they got grandchildren. They got 6 grandchildren. They're and they live in. My nephew lives in Florida. My niece lives in Seattle. Okay, and we started afterwards with the catering, and thank God in 1979 I met my darling wife Diana. We got married in Hendon Adas, and we had a wedding celebration at the Lord's, and it was a lovely day. It was a bit drizzly that day, and thank God. And then we decided to move to Kenton. And we were blessed with 3 lovely children, Natalie, Daniel, and Susie. And then a few years later, Susie got married to a lovely boy, Ben, and we have a gorgeous grandson called Solly. In 1988, my father made a documentary. He went back to Russia to make the documentary called In the Sewers of Lvov, to tell him in his experiences, how it happened and how he spent all the 14 months in the sewers there. My mother was too traumatized. She did not want to go to Lvov to make the documentary, but she participated in the documentary that was made in London. But a few years and subsequently, a book was written called In the Sewers of Lvov by the producer of the program, Robert Marshall. Many years later, a cinema film was made. It was made in darkness, and it was 4 or 5 years ago, and it was well received. I've lived in Kenton all the rest since we've been married. And please God, I'm going to retire in 2 days' time from the work I was doing, from the mini-cabbing, working for Alice Lee. I know that they're very annoyed I'm leaving, but I want to stay home with Diana and go out more with her. And I think enough's enough. I think I've said everything I need. And plus, I've always been in Kenton working, going to with the community. I've been for all the years with the Chevra Kadisha ever since its inception, and that was a big mitzvah that we do, and I really enjoy Kenton and all the people, and I think everyone does a wonderful job. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Koef.
Thank you.
Oh,
That was wonderful, Henry.
thank you very much.
Really a wonderful talk about your family and your
Yes.
work, and it was wonderful to hear that. And your sister was in on it as well, and I think she wrote a book. I think it's called The Green Jacket, I think. anyway, the focus of your life is something that interests all of us, and I'm sure there are quite a lot of questions to all our three speakers.
Yeah, with pleasure.
And so if you're all prepared to answer the questions, there's nothing in the chat, so I think maybe in person, let me